This is Under the Influence, a show about coercive control. Please be aware that this show covers subjects some may find distressing.
Hello and welcome to Under the Influence. My name's Joe, and this week we are joined by Kacey from the Cult Folk podcast. How you doing?
Hi, Joe. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's good weather here. I mean, I'm not sure what it's like where you are, but the rain seems to have gone and the sun shines here, so it's a good day.
We're going to discuss the bite model of coercive control today, among other things, kind of as an introduction to the subject and the psychology of coercive control. A lot of our listeners will have come to my podcast and maybe yours as kind of, maybe through the kind of true crime angle, where it's kind of a bit salacious or a bit kind of, it's important to realize that these techniques work on almost anybody. And a lot of people, I think, feel that people who are or were involved in cults are maybe a bit stupid, a bit naive, a bit whatever. And I think it's important that it's not that simple and it can happen to anyone.
I think you're right. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of misconceptions that I tend to come across from individuals who may not know so much about the subject as I do at this point. I was certainly one of those people who had those misconceptions, who perhaps wasn't compassionate or sensitive or as open-minded as I perhaps should have been about individuals that experience these techniques. You're right when you say almost anybody can be susceptible to certain methods that are used by abusers and con artists and cult leaders and psychopaths and narcissists. And, maybe you find all of those personality traits and identifiers in single individuals. It's important to recognize that anybody can be a victim of those techniques, but also to recognize that there is a very large demographic of individuals who are born and raised into these groups who have no predetermined personality or experiences to draw on for typical everyday life that you and I might experience outside of a coercive environment. So it's not just a matter of saying, I would never join a cult, or why didn't you just leave the cult? If your entire existence and family and belief systems and everything that you've been taught and everything you've learned up to that point is based around a particular group, it's not that you've joined the group, and it's not that you can just walk away. So you make an important point when you talk about compassion. I think compassion is the right word to use, and it's certainly one that I would use when it comes to speaking with cult survivors, which is primarily what I do on my podcast.
I guess it's also important to mention that a lot of these techniques and kind of tactics are not just about cults. It can be controlling relationships. It can be some kind of conspiracy groups, political groups, terrorist groups, extremist groups, all these sorts of things can fall under these categories. Anyway, so this is the BITE model, BITE, which is from Dr. Stephen Hassan's book. Dr. Stephen Hassan himself was a member of the Unification Church, often called the Moonies, in the 70s, I think, and his own experience kind of played into this. So anyway, BITE are the four sections. First one is behavior control. Number one, to regulate individuals' physical reality. So you've spoken a bit about how various groups might go about doing that. And I guess it's also related to the second one of dictating where, how, and with whom the member lives and associates and isolates.
Certainly, that's certainly a go-to answer. I think a lot of the time individuals can be encouraged to move to different parts of a country or the world for typically evangelizing purposes. For example, people might be sent on missions to different countries to spread the doctrine of their specific group. Doesn't always have to be religious. Typically, a lot of the time, of course, with evangelizing, it would be religious. But that can also be the case with things like self-help groups like Nexium. We saw people highly encouraged to move to different parts of America to help set up centers, to help recruit more people, to help funnel more people into that business model to generate more money. And you would see that replicated in a lot of things like multi-level marketing. also a strategy that we see a lot in terms of isolating individuals and really cementing a person's position in a group, making it more difficult for them to leave, is weaponizing family members against one another. So it might be that parents are separated from their children. We see this in groups like the Unification Church that have homes that children are sent to whilst their parents are moved around the world on different mission trips and different quests for leadership, which of course within the group are seen as a blessing, are seen as an opportunity to move further into or higher up in the religious organization. But what that means for the children, like we've seen in Coercive that Erica Bourneman talks about, fantastic author and writer if anybody wants to learn more about a Christian mission in South Africa. We've seen it talked about with the Rajneesh movement, where children are sent to boarding schools that are set up for children to move into. And the idea around practices like this in Synanon in the 1970s, the message would be, your children have to learn to be independent without you. And also, your children are a distraction from the true work or the true mission or God's will. Whatever title a group would want to use, what you tend to find within groups is that there are earmarks of similarities from one group to another. They just use different terminology in their group to explain the same thing. So that's definitely another way that people have their environments controlled, is that they have their children taken from them, separated from them. And the really insidious thing that you tend to find with that practice is that it's other parents who have been separated from their children who are then told that they have to take care of other people's children. And that is something that's coming out a lot now with second or multi-generational adults who have left cults after being born into them. They are saying, other parents raised me and my parents raised other children. And it's just that they weren't allowed to be together. The main reasoning for that, of course, is because your allegiance should only be to leadership. And so if you are with your children are a distraction from making money, from getting more people into the group, whatever the agenda is for leadership with your particular role in the group.
A couple of things that you mentioned as well reminded me of, so controlling relationships, obviously quite often we'll use this number 2, of controlling kind of the environment and the behavior of the person being controlled. This also, when you're talking about kids and parents and the kind of family relationships, very much also reminds me of various groups that have kind of different euphemisms such as disassociation or disconnection, whereby family members are kind of separated from each other. It's a minefield, isn't it?
It is. So, yeah, it is. And it's designed that way.
Yes.
Of course, if you can convince a family to move away from their hometown to a different part of a country or the world, then they're isolated from everyone that they know back home, which means that the group can then reinforce the retention or the retainment of individuals in the group. You see with groups like the Children of God, typically what happens is that individuals are sent to compounds or communes in different parts of the world. And when they arrive at those locations, they have their passports and their identity papers taken away from them. They have their money, possessions taken away from them, because the idea is that you live frugally and you live as a family, which means that you share everything. You share your possessions, but you also share yourself, which explicitly is inclusive of your body in all manner of ways, which is where the child sexual abuse comes from. But what the Children of God do then is they not only take away your identifying papers and your money to keep this message of we all live as one, they're stopping you from being able to leave in that way. And the compounds are usually in secret locations because it's illegal to rape children, wherever you are in the world. So they're very secretive about where their compounds exist, which means that when you arrive as a member and have your papers and your money taken away from you, you don't know exactly where you are. And it's likely that you're in a country where your native language is not spoken. So you have a language barrier, you have a financial barrier, you can't move across borders because you don't have your papers. And within these environments where contraception is not allowed, women are forced to have sex all of the time, and children are being born that aren't being registered, that typically don't have access to healthcare. So there's also an element of medical neglect. And then once you bring children into the situation, you're cemented there even further. So it really is it's what occult expert Alexandra Stain would call an all-encompassing authoritarian totalitarian system. It comes at you from all angles, and so it makes it really hard to leave.
You very neatly mentioned number 3 there. Control when, how, and with whom the member has sex. Number 4, control types of clothing and hairstyles. Quite often what can come with that is new names and things like that. So 5 and 6, I think, are big ones as well. Regulate diet, so food, drink, and hunger and fasting. Also, manipulation and deprivation of sleep. Those, I think, have a major impact. I mean, there's a reason, for instance, that deprivation of sleep is considered a form of torture and has been used in Guantanamo Bay, for instance. If you're not getting the right nutrition and you're not getting enough sleep, that will mess anyone up. I think that's basic human need, isn't it?
Yes, there's certainly lots of different elements of a person's everyday life which are controlled within these environments. So typically you would see someone's leisure time restricted or controlled, relationships inside and outside of the group restricted and controlled. And along with that comes people's clothing, hairstyles, expectations on how and where they will be educated and to what level they will receive education as well. Typically in religious groups, high demand religious groups, fundamentalist more so than others, it will be men that are encouraged to continue certain educational trainings or mission work, and women will be called to stay back and take on what fundamentalists would see as a woman's role in the house. So kind of like 1950s and before. The element of controlling somebody's clothing is not only to create a sense of unity and conformity within a group setting, and also to reinforce the idea of us versus them. We are this group and this is us, and anybody who is outside of this group is not with us, and so therefore we shouldn't be communicating with those people. It's also a way to make sure that people aren't spending unnecessary money. A lot of religious groups, a lot of groups that have propaganda that they sell, books or leaflets or pamphlets or DVDs or even animes and comic books. There is the idea that if you are spending money on forbidden substances like coffee and tobacco and alcohol, which are typically quite expensive, you're going to have less money to give to us. Therefore, you're not allowed to eat these foods. You're not allowed to drink these things. You're not allowed to do the things that we're telling you to do. If you restrict a person's leisure time, then they're not likely to be out spending money on family days out at the circus or Disneyland or any of those things as well. So it's not just restricting a person's everyday routine and activity and identity. It's also restricting everything on top of that, which again reinforces the group's leadership's agenda.
And there neatly is number 8. So yes, restricting leisure, entertainment and vacation time. It's in American English, so vacation, holiday time. Number 9, major time spent with group indoctrination and rituals, and or self-indoctrination, including in modern times the internet. This quite frequently in groups can be kind of long-winded meditation sessions or any kind of ritualistic behavior which puts people in a more suggestive state quite frequently.
Yep. And what you mentioned there about the self-indoctrination would include things that we are seeing more often now in terms of accessing online spaces. So with the conspiratorial online groups that are popping up thick and fast, people tend to be taking themselves down rabbit holes of more and more slightly extremist and conspiratorial areas of the internet, and then those beliefs or those opinions are bolstered by other individuals who share similar sentiments, and therefore generating an online community of people who have not necessarily been led by somebody or by a group or by a particular system that is already in place, but have found themselves in those positions through aggressive online algorithms. And also another way that that is happening, which isn't something that's new, is with people like a figure that I've been covering recently on the podcast known as Liana Shanti. She is a self-proclaimed guru, and she encourages individuals to buy her audio tapes and listen to them on repeat in an isolated setting where they can really listen to what this person is saying. Simultaneous to that is going back a few steps in the behavior quadrant of the bite model, is that individuals at the same time as this are being encouraged to go on juice cleanses and liquid-based diets or fasts, as well as participate in the use of regular enemas to cleanse or purify their bodies. And so what you have there is people entering a state of starvation and not having 100% hold on their cognitive faculties, which again puts them into a position of suggestibility. So if you're listening then to an individual's influential messages through an audio in your ears on repeat, you're going to be influenced by certain messages within that audio. This listening to audio on repeat is something that Rajneesh used, that Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. So this is not uncommon, it's not new, but none of this new age stuff and online stuff is. QAnon is based on conspiracy theories that have been rehashed and reused hundreds of times over. They've just had different names and terminology and have taken place in different parts of history. So again, it's just people rebranding certain things to take ownership of them. There's not a lot of creativity in any of these groups that pop up. They all follow the same handbook.
Yep. Number 10, permission required for major decisions. And this is quite interesting because my colleague Kaya and myself have interviewed people for this podcast, and even after years later can feel like they need permission to. Is that something you've come across?
Absolutely, all of the time. It can be decisions on, as we mentioned, where people will study, what they will study. It can be decisions on who people can date, who they will marry, who they will divorce, and then who else they will marry in the group. It can be decisions on anything down from what someone will eat and when they will eat, all the way through to major decisions on, whether a person will have another baby, even though it's been told to them that being pregnant again or going through labor again has a high chance of death because of complications that arise with a full groups where women have tons and tons of babies, and of course that takes its toll on the human body. So it can be all of those things. I mean, the Jehovah's Witnesses have a rather extreme blood doctrine, which the members are coerced into abiding by, which basically just means that they can't accept any type of blood if a person is rushed to hospital and they are a Jehovah's Witness and they need a blood transfusion, or they'll die. Typically what you see in that group is that the person will die. Blood is not given, and this can be from car accidents or from childbirth, or all manner of things. It's a tricky doctrine.
Yeah, indeed. So number 11, rewards and punishments used to modify behaviours, both positive and negative. And number 12, to discourage individualism and encourage groupthink. I think those very much related to, for instance, the regulating diet, regulating clothing. So impose rigid rules and regulations, number 13. Number 14, punish disobedience by beating, torture, cutting, rape, or tattooing and branding. We're really kind of getting into many of the answers of why don't you just leave, right?
On the extreme end, you have cases like Nexium where women are branded and they have collateral taken from them, whether that is explicit pictures of themselves or admissions in writing or audio form of a crime that they've committed. And that is then held over an individual and threatened to that individual to be released publicly if a person leaves the group. So there is that type of coercive behavior control that exists. But also on the other side of that, there are other tactics that are used that might not be seen as extreme but have the same effect. So there is the threat of violence, but not the act of violence. And sometimes the threat can be just as powerful as the act, sometimes even more so. So a lot of the time, a way to retain a person's tenure within a group is to make them scared of something, whether that is the upcoming doomsday, where everybody that's not a part of this particular group will go to hell or will die in holy fire, or whichever imagery a group chooses to use. It could be the fear of shunning, which again is something that the Jehovah's Witnesses do, where you will be excommunicated and nobody that you were previously associated with within that particular group will speak to you anymore. This is a very common thing that is used within groups, but it's extremely effective, especially if an individual is born and raised in a group and has no connections to anybody that isn't in that group outside of that group. So again, makes it very difficult for a person to leave. When groups have systemic beating of children, this is a way to, quote, break the spirit of the child, which again encourages conformity and again encourages groupthink. So all of these things, they complement each other, as you've said, and add to that totalitarian system. You know, what Jan Jelalich, leading cult expert, would say is a self-sealing system. So it's cut off from everything on the outside. And another way that you can do that doesn't include the physical beating is public shaming. So you would then have the threat of being called out in front of the group and shamed in front of everybody with either private information that you've said in confidence to leadership about struggles you've had, or complications in your marriage, or worries you have about your children, or things you've done with a same-sex partner, because that's always a big point of contention in a lot of these high-demand groups. No time or space for anybody that identifies as part of the LGBT community. And also a lot of the time, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, because high-demand groups just seem to be non-accepting of any marginalized groups, even if they are a marginalized fringe extremist group themselves. So it doesn't have to be branding and it doesn't have to be physical abuse, even though we see those things. It can also be the threat of being called out in front of your peers, the threat of having your collateral released publicly. It's all very, very difficult to navigate.
So should we move on to the second section, I? So number one, deception, to deliberately withhold information, to distort information to make it more acceptable, and to systematically lie to the cult member. Now, quite often a thing that will happen here is that there'll be an acceptable truth which will be said to new members or will be said to the public at large, and you won't discover the true beliefs of the group until you get to a certain point and you've been sufficiently kind of indoctrinated into those beliefs, or you've got sufficient of these controlling kind of claws into you. And so you kind of learn more about the true beliefs of the group as you kind of go up the hierarchy.
Yeah, that's certainly something that is common across groups. I think a lot of the time deception can be used to initially lure people into groups to begin with. You see a lot with cult leaders like NXIVM, where Keith Raniere has this really colorful, rich history of being the most intelligent man in the world, and has his name in the Guinness World Book of Records, and has like an astonishing IQ that's almost unheard of, and received a $1 million check from the Dalai Lama, which only enforces his position in his own community. You know, without the recent controversy of the Dalai Lama, with that aside, it's seen as a way of Keith Raniere having his character endorsed. There is no reason for new members of NXIVM to doubt what they are being told about Keith Raniere, because all of the other community members, all of the other group members, they believe it, and they are telling the new members, this is who this person is, this is what he's accomplished, this is what he's capable of. and they know that because they've been told that from the previous round of people who were told by the previous round of people. And you can trace it all the way back to him just making things up, telling it to the initial Nexium Inner Circle members. If you said something like that to me today, I don't have any reason to do research into whether you're telling me the truth or not. Inherently, humans trust each other. And a lot of the time, that's why the best of us find ourselves in the worst situations.
Yeah, absolutely. So number two, to minimize and discourage access to non-cult sources of information, including internet, TV, radio, books, etc. Limiting access to any critical information to former members, and to keep members busy so they don't have time to think and investigate. And to control through mobile phone or cell phone, it says here, with texting, calls and internet tracking. So again, this is quite common to say, for instance, to members of a group that you can only read books by the leader, the guru, or you can only, don't read anything critical about it because it's all lies or they're...
Yep, certainly. You see in, for example, the troubled teen industry, which is heavily influenced by groups like Synanon that existed in the 70s, where parents are not told the conditions that their children are living in, and the children are not allowed to tell their parents what is happening in those environments. So typically the children that are enrolled into these troubled teen programs are enrolled into programs that are states away from where their home is. And if a child on the phone is to say, Mum, I'm having to sit through these so-called therapy sessions every day where we all scream at each other and it's really abusive and I'm scared and I want to come home, the phone calls are monitored by the staff of the school, who will end that call before a child has a chance to tell their parents exactly what's happening. If parents do catch wind of any of the exploitative and abusive practices that take place within these programs, the parents are told that the children are manipulating them and that the child will not improve, their behavior will not improve, their grades, their mental health, whatever the reason is for the child to be placed in this program to begin with, will not improve unless the child completes the course. Typically, courses can last a few months to a few years. And also, when the child comes home, they're unable to regulate in a typical society because they've lived in this isolated environment being abused for a prolonged period of time.
So number three says about compartmentalizing information into insider versus outsider doctrines. So that's something I've mentioned previously. To control information at different levels and missions within a group. Again, so it's this idea that you discover new things as you work up the hierarchy, and the people kind of below you in the hierarchy are not allowed to know those things, and members of the public are not allowed to know those things. And allow only the leadership to decide who needs to know what and when.
Yeah, I mean, Scientology is the go-to for that one. I think they have these different levels within the group that you can pay money to unlock. To like, it's kind of like a pay as you play mobile game. Oh, you've got this far, and to get to the next level, you pay us this money, and you can unlock all these new features. Scientology promises secret knowledge, hidden knowledge, the further up these levels you go. They're called OT levels. And it's been revealed by former members who have paid millions to reach the highest levels and then realized that they're potentially being conned, and then have left Scientology and gone on to whistleblow about the organization, have said that at these higher levels, what is revealed to you is that actually there's this evil guy called Xenu, and we should all be trying to avoid Xenu. And there's a lot of talk about UFOs and space and aliens and body thetans and becoming clear. And so that's Scientology. But you also see that type of thing in a lot of esoteric groups. So there's a group in New York called the Odyssey Study Group. That is a secret group that promises hidden knowledge to people who become part of the group obviously pay a hefty monthly subscription fee to be a member of that group, and are not allowed to tell anybody about any of the things that they're doing, any of their involvement in the group. And the dangers with groups like that is, as we see in things like the Order of the Solar Temple, is that secret societies and hidden groups that base their teachings on esotericism, is that members become so isolated by not being able to share any of the information of their involvement with if I'm a Jehovah's Witness, I can go to a Kingdom Hall and I'm probably not going to keep that from anybody. If I want to leave the group, I might keep that from everybody. But if I'm a member of the Freemasons or the Rosicrucians or the Order of the Solar Temple, part of my role within that group is keeping that information to myself. And I am breaking some of the core teachings and tenets of that group if I tell anybody about my involvement or about the existence of the group or about the teachings of the group. And what can happen in those extreme circumstances, as we've seen with groups like the Order of the Solar Temple, is mass murder suicides, where leadership spiral out of control with greed or desperation, to the point where the only option in their minds is to kill off the entire group. So, of course, that doesn't happen all of the time. And not every hidden group or secret group that promises hidden and secret knowledge is going to have that outcome. But it's certainly something that can happen. And how can law enforcement or any other type of organization plant any preventative measures if you have no idea that it exists to begin with? If Heaven's Gate and the People's Temple aren't examples of hidden groups or secret societies, but they are examples of groups that went to extreme measures to isolate themselves from the outside world. You have Heaven's Gate locking themselves up in their mansion, and Jim Jones taking his members to South America, to the jungle of Guyana, to make sure that he could continue to reign over every single member without outside influences or the watchful eyes of the press, who had taken notice of his extreme leadership style.
Yeah, indeed. Right, so number 4, to encourage spying on other members, impose a buddy system to monitor and control a member, report deviant thoughts, feelings and actions to leadership.
It's also to bring in another element of that fear. If we're too busy watching each other and to make sure that our actions aren't being observed when we do something, or to observe others so that we can go to leadership with that information, if we're all more worried about each other, perhaps we're not thinking critically about what leadership is saying to us, about what they're asking of us, about what they're doing to us. And also, if there is that element of public shaming and you're encouraged to take any information back to leadership, and then that person that you have shared information about is then pulled up in front of the group and publicly shamed, again, we're seeing that system come together where all of the nefarious elements all complement each other. And it's another layer of fear. But also what that does when you are feeding all of the information back to leadership is it allows the leader to appear all-knowing and almost have mystical knowledge and truly be enlightened, if that is what they are claiming to be, as a lot of cult leaders do. If you have not shared your thoughts and feelings or current events in your life with many people, and all of a sudden leadership come to you and say, I know that you're thinking this, that you're feeling this, that you've been doing this, part of you might be like, oh my goodness, they really know everything, they really see everything. And it's another layer of fear, but it can also generate another layer of renovation for leadership as well.
So number 5, extensive use of cult-generated information and propaganda. Be misquoting statements or using them out of context from non-cult sources.
It's typical, as you said, it's typical to be part of a group that says, if you want to read a book, you can go to our bookshop and you can buy something from our bookshop, and we store or stock all of the books that you're allowed to read. And they're all by the person that founded and leads the group, I think L. Ron Hubbard is like one of the most published authors of all time. I think he has something like the title of most published author ever, or most translated author ever, or perhaps something like that. But it's pretty wild. And a lot of the time, people within Scientology or groups like New Kadampa Tradition, for example, are told, if you want to read, you can read a book by this person. We store all of the books. You can buy them from us. Oh my goodness, we print them too. Part of our business that volunteers within the group, volunteers in air quotes, of course, volunteers within the group run our bookshops or run our print shops, and we print the books that we sell, and the money goes back to us. But that means back to leadership.
What a coincidence.
Yeah. So again, self-sealing system, all-encompassing.
Number 6, unethical use of confessions. This is something you've mentioned before about coercing people to confess things which can then later be used against them.
Yeah, that's something that is a staple part of the troubled teen industry. Children and young adults are told to write or take part in confession sessions. The really abusive part of these sessions of these letters is that therapists and staff won't allow you to move on to the next stage or to have any privileges like chocolate, extra reading time.
I think we should put privileges in air quotes here as well.
Yeah, privileges are things that, most of us can just, if we want to go to the bathroom without anyone watching us, that is what in some troubled teen programs would be considered a privilege, because in a lot of these programs, the toilets don't even have doors on them. So what I mean by that is, if a person wants to leave a program, they typically have to work through a set of stages to move on to the next stage. The again, air quotes, therapists or staff have to sign each student or prisoner, is a word that I've heard used before, have to sign them through these stages. And sometimes if a person says, I've smoked a bit of marijuana, but that's the only drug I've ever tried. If staff aren't happy with that, they will keep saying, no, that's not all you've done. No, that's not all you've done, which not only is coercive and gaslighting, it also leads to people falsely confessing to things like taking cocaine, trying heroin, giving other people drugs without telling them, all sorts of things that people haven't done, which goes all the way back to Robert J. Lifton's work with prisoners of war back in the 1950s and 60s, falsely confessing to things that they hadn't done because, of course, they were being tortured. So the bite model that Stephen Hassan developed for his PhD thesis, which is also included in his book, Combating Cult Mind Control, that all stems from the basis of Robert J. Lifton's original work. So all of the cult experts draw their work from that basis of research.
Well, thank you for the extra context. I wasn't, so I'm aware of Robert J. Lifton, but I wasn't necessarily aware of how much Dr. Hassan had drawn from that. So that's interesting. So on to number 3, the T of BITE. Number 1, require members to internalize the group's doctrine as truth. This includes adopting the group's map of reality as their reality, instill black and white thinking, decide between good versus evil, and organize people into us versus them, insiders versus outsiders. You've talked about this kind of us versus them, and I think it's very interesting how all of these groups, they need an enemy. They really thrive with this idea that there is an other.
Yes, and that can take all manner of shape and form from group to group. And also it can be broken down into smaller parts as well. So if you were to take, for example, the Lighthouse International Group, which has been the focus of BBC documentaries and podcasts recently, the Lighthouse International Group is a coaching company where people are trained to deliver coaching to people who want to develop their relationships or develop their businesses. What happens in that environment is something that's much different to that, but that comes from promising you that you can overcome your own enemy which is not being able to maintain a relationship or not being able to build your business, and also generating new enemies simultaneously. So one example is that there is a mother who was coerced out of hundreds of thousands of pounds by her two sons who were a part of Lighthouse International Group. The reason that her sons were able to do that to her is because they had been pulled into the group and promised self-improvement, all whilst being told that their mother is an abuser, that she is a narcissist, that she has caused all of these problems in these two brothers' lives, which isn't necessarily true. It's not only reinforcing the two brothers' need for guidance to overcome the issues that they've got with their mother, it's also reinforcing the allegiance that the brothers have to the leadership, because the leadership then are the only people that can help them overcome this supposed abuse that they've suffered from their mother, which, funnily enough, only became apparent after they met leadership. Again, it's all encompassing. It always comes back to everything complementing the other things. It can look like us versus the government because they want to shut us down. Shinrikyo had very similar sentiments to that. You can see it in the Branch Davidians, but that was also complemented with doomsday theology and rhetoric. The end of the world is coming. We need to stock up on supplies. It's us versus Satan. We have to overcome all of the evil in the world. The only way we can do that is to keep evangelizing, is to stock our fridges and wait for the end of the world. On a group by group basis, very different, but there is always an enemy. It could be something that exists. It could be something that we can't see. It could be your next door neighbor, but it will always be something that isolates you further from people outside of the group and strengthens your allegiance to the leadership.
Yeah, and I guess that's also the basis of any conspiracy theory, isn't it? Is there needs to be an enemy. So I thought it was also very interesting that you were saying about the enemy sometimes being internal.
There's a lot of messages within groups that if something good happens, that's because of your belief in the beliefs or devotion to the beliefs, to the leadership, to the deity, to the chosen figurehead. If something bad happens, that's because you're having bad thoughts, you're having negative thoughts, you're not as invested in the belief system as you once were. So it's all of the good stuff, leadership's fault. All of the bad stuff, your fault. And if you typically go to leadership and say, I'm having a hard time, I'm having a bad time, I'm questioning this part of the teachings, of the beliefs, not only are you setting yourself up for things like potentially being public shamed or shunned, you're also probably going to be told that it's your fault you think and feel that way, and you should go away and you should pray more, read the scripture more, chant more, meditate more. Whatever the mechanism for switching off an individual's critical thinking is within that group, that is typically what you will be told to go and do.
Absolutely, well said. So number 2, to change a person's name and identity. So a lot of groups, people will be given new names. Identity, we've talked about clothing and other things. Number 3, use of loaded language and cliches.
It's something that you can see in almost every group. There's like a language or a lingo that's used. In Nexium, they say things like ethical. You need to work on your ethics and you're not being ethical. Very similar to Scientology. And there is a lot of research that links Keith Raniere's kind of, inspiration taking from Scientology. But that's one example of a term that you and I would hear and interpret very differently to how a former member of Nexium would hear that word and react. So a lot of the time, individuals within certain groups will use terminology that to an outsider would be totally alien. We wouldn't be able to participate in those conversations. And it's another way of isolating individuals and creating that us versus them divide. It's very cleverly done. And it can take an individual that leaves a group an entire lifetime to overcome from falling into using those phrases and that terminology. So it's, as I said, the same thing across every group. They just use different words in their respective environments.
Yeah, it's really insidious, isn't it? Number 4, to encourage only good and proper thoughts. Good and proper in air quotes there. Number 5, hypnotic techniques are used to alter mental states, undermine critical thinking. And number 6, memories are manipulated and false memories are created, such as, no, you did take cocaine. No, you did deal drugs to other people. You just don't remember it, or you just don't realize it, or to use your example.
Or telling two brothers that their mother has abused them.
Yes.
When it's likely that she hasn't. Yep.
Number 7, teaching thought-stopping cliches which shut down reality testing by stopping negative thoughts and allowing only positive thoughts, including denial, rationalization, justification, wishful thinking, chanting, meditating, praying, speaking in tongues, singing, or humming.
Yeah, there's a term that is used to explain some of that, which is thought terminating cliches. If you were having some doubts about some things, whether it was the country you were told to move to, or the person you were told to marry, or whether you were going to stay in the group at all. If you were having doubts about some things and you went to leadership, they might say something to you like, you're not allowed to think that way. You're not allowed to feel that way. You need to just go and pray. These are thought terminating cliches. The conversation doesn't go any further. It's a shut off point. There's no more discussion around that. It's your issue. You need to go and fix it. And there still might be consequences if leadership find out that that's how you're thinking and feeling anyway. So there's thought terminating cliches, but there is also this idea that if you conform and if you are part of groupthink in a setting like a mega church or a charismatic church where everybody may be speaking in tongues or in a frenzied state, and you participate in that environment, again, you are in a position where you could be vulnerable or susceptible to suggestions. And it's hard because if you're having doubts and you're also being placed in those environments, we have this thing called cognitive dissonance, where it's two different thoughts or ideas conflicting against one another at the same time. So you might be listening to a room full of people speaking in tongues and thinking, oh my goodness, this is overwhelming. But you might also, as someone said to me yesterday, hear Uncle Dave behind you going, blah, 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 and that's his version of speaking in tongues. So part of your mind is like, oh my God, he is just speaking gibberish. He's not speaking some sentient, ancient, magical language that can communicate with higher beings. He's just making noises with his mouth. But then the other part of your brain is like, whoa, it's so overwhelming in this environment. Everyone's speaking in tongues, but I'm not. Or maybe I am. And maybe I feel like I'm actually having some type of spiritual experience. And now I'm crying, and now I'm overwhelmed, and now I'm on the floor and people are laying hands on me. Am I being slain in the spirit? Am I having a religious experience? Everyone's telling me that I am. Everyone's love bombing me. They're telling me how proud they are of me for speaking in tongues. They're telling me how proud they are of me for having a religious experience. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe I'll pretend that it happens again because I love the reaction that I get from everybody. And it goes round and round and round. And it's so difficult to run with the conflicting doubts and the critical thoughts. They are quashed, and they are significantly smaller than the thoughts that are supportive of the group, at least at first.
Number 8, rejection of rational analysis, critical thinking, and constructive criticism. Number 9, to forbid critical questions about the leader, the doctrine, or the policies. Number 10, labeling of alternative belief system as illegitimate, evil, or not useful. And number 11, to instill a new map of reality.
If a person is born into a certain group and they are taught a version of reality from birth, it's going to be difficult to help that person understand that there is another reality that exists that most of us live within. I think that if a person joins a group and is subjected to things like sleep deprivation and food restriction and isolated from family and friends and familiar things outside of the group, and is then subjected to things like love bombing and long sessions about the group's teachings that are bolstered by everybody that says, yes, this is exactly the way we should be living. I think that most people would stand a slim chance at not being affected by that and not having a new reality brought into their worldview.
Yeah, absolutely. Could or would happen to anybody in those circumstances. So on to the fourth column, which is the E of the BITE model, BIETE, emotional control. Number one, to manipulate and narrow the range of feelings. Some emotions and or needs are deemed as evil, wrong, or selfish.
Comes to my mind with that particular part of the emotional quadrant is that when people come across individuals that are suspected of being cult members, they say they were like a zombie or they seemed dead in the eyes. And this is where we see examples of people not expressing much range of emotion. It's a training over time that takes place, where eventually a visceral emotional reaction to a certain type of abuse, like a certain type of sexual abuse, for example, may result in somebody becoming so decompartmentalized that they just don't react anymore to those things. It's again like breaking the spirit of a child by systemically beating them every time they fidget on the blanket at church or whatever version that looks like. And cutting somebody's emotions down like that comes back to a point that was in the previous quadrant about infantilizing people as well, and causing them to go backwards in terms of their maturity and if you infantilize somebody enough, they become completely reliant and dependent on the person that makes the decisions. So again, decision making then becomes a big part of leadership's responsibility, because a person is so dependent on them to make those decisions. It can become, as we saw with the case with Larry Ray, it can become as dominant as when people go to the bathroom, when people eat and how much they eat. People can become as dependent on asking people for permission to shower, to urinate. It really can become extreme.
I watched the documentary about Larry Ray, and it's just, yeah, it's an amazing example of gaslighting. It's just the kind of perfect, I don't want to make it sound like it's a good thing, but like it's just...
No, there's examples of there's examples of all of the things that you've talked about can be seen in the case of Larry Ray: the infantilizing, the increasing of dependence, the gaslighting, the leisure restriction, food restriction, separating people from outside of the group, and everything down to, you know, where people will work, how many hours they'll work. It's a horrific case of coercive control of all kinds: financially, sexually, physically, emotionally, and spiritually as well. And also, if we're talking about the Hulu documentary Stolen Youth is a fantastic example of sensitive and compassionate and informed documentary creating. And so if anybody was ever going to check out a documentary about the case of Larry Ray, then I would recommend that documentary. I would also probably recommend that documentary above most other documentaries about any type of cult or coercive control.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't have that sensationalism. Yeah, number 2, to teach emotion stopping techniques to block feelings of homesickness, anger, and doubt. So you've spoken about blocking feelings of doubt, certainly. It's interesting that homesickness is mentioned as well, because if you have like a commune or a compound, or people are living members of a group, then obviously the homesickness is going to be a factor.
And another way to get around homesickness is to bring the entire family into the fold, into the group, into the movement somehow.
Yeah. So number 3, to make the person feel that problems are always their own fault and never the leader or the group's fault. So you've definitely touched on that one. Number 4, to promote feelings of guilt or unworthiness, such as identity guilt, you're not living up to your potential, your family is deficient, your past is suspect, your affiliations are unwise, your thoughts, feelings, actions are irrelevant or selfish.
Something that Janja Lalich talks a lot about is family cults and one-on-one cults. So typically it's not widely recognized by people outside of the world of cult education and prevention that cults can be made up of smaller numbers. And what springs to my mind when you talk about telling a person that their actions, thoughts, or feelings are selfish and are only going to benefit the victim in this case, it feels very narcissistic. It feels very controlling. It feels like what you might expect a dominant and abusive spouse to say to their subjugated partner. And that is very much in keeping with what Evan Stark writes about in his book, The Psychology of Coercive Control, which is kind of what you said opening up this discussion. So it feels very apt to be mentioning Evan's work in terms of the women's rights movement and coercive control against and the subjugation of women when it comes to the idea that the perpetrator and the narcissist, who is, of course, the selfish one, putting those thoughts and feelings onto the person that they are abusing. So that's what comes to my mind when I hear that terminology.
Yeah, definitely. And another reminder also that, like, it's not just about groups. It's, controlling relationships definitely fit into this model. Number 6, extremes of emotional highs and lows, love bombing and praise 1 minute, and then declaring you're a horrible sinner the next. Those two extremes are very much dependent on how much you go along with things. Or
the idea that a person is loved conditionally within these groups is something that's talked about a lot on my podcast in particular. I'm not sure how much it's focused on in other areas, but typically what is explored by individuals who come on the show to tell their lived experiences is that when they are recruiting new members, when they are tithing exceptional amounts of money or gifting things of notable worth to the group, or satiating leadership and their sexual advances, if you are seen to be giving excessively, then you will be given that conditional love and praise. And it can quickly turn toxic, as we see in multi-level marketing groups, where if you don't speak positively, or if you don't bring in new people, or if you don't kiss the arse basically of leadership all of the time, you will then receive the toxic side of the group, which feels like shunning, which feels like high school friendship groups where you have a crush on your friend's crush, and then all of a sudden the whole group of friends isn't talking to you. It's very much like that, but it's very effective. It's very effective in getting people to not vocalize their disappointments in leadership, to not vocalize their doubt. And of course, once somebody is internalizing those thoughts and then they're having thought terminating cliches applied to them as well, then their internal monologue is also being shut off as well. So conditional love and support and community is definitely something that is almost seen and recognized within every single high demand group.
Yeah, absolutely. This idea of the conditionality of it is key. Yeah. Number 7, ritualistic and sometimes public confession of sins. This is something that you've previously touched on. Phobia indoctrination, in calculating irrational fears about leaving the group or questioning the leader's authority. This idea that there's no happiness or fulfillment possible outside of the group, that there's terrible consequences if you leave, hell, demon possession, incurable diseases, accidents, suicide, insanity, 10,000 reincarnations, etc. Shunning of those who leave, fear of being rejected by friends and family. This idea that there's never a legitimate reason to leave, and those that leave are weak, undisciplined, or unspiritual, worldly, brainwashed by family or a counselor, or seduced by money, sex, or rock and roll. And finally, threats of harm to the ex-member and family.
I think the idea of something that you mentioned previously around the threat of the outside world is something that comes out in almost every interview that I do. So within the troubled teen industry, the children and the young adults are threatened by staff, typically telling them that if you do not complete this program, you will leave here and you will end up dead or in jail. You will end up killing yourself or someone else and end up in prison. And you have a lot of groups that children are born into and raised in, telling them that if you leave this group, you will be murdered, you will be raped, you will be conned out of all of your money, you will be used by a company to make them richer at your expense. And what is, of course, not recognized by members in the group is that all of those things are often happening to them inside the group anyway. And what a lot of people have expressed about leaving a group is this profound experience of realizing that actually all of the ways that the outside world was explained to them, of course, is not true. And most typical worldly, apostate, unsaved people, whichever word the group would use for us people outside, is that most of us are just people. getting on with life. And we're not interested in all of the horrible, abusive and offensive things that members are threatened with until they leave.
So we've come to the end of the bite model. It's been fascinating. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Everyone should go and check out Kacey's podcast called The Cult Vault.
Thank you, Jo. I appreciate it. Have a good day.